This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. You know, one of the tricks in doing a podcast that goes back to 2012, how do I stay alive and continue to do this nonstop, right? It takes a little time. I'm pretty addicted to it, but sometimes you want to take a break for a day or something like that. This is one of those days, but don't fret. I'm not going to leave you hanging. I'm going to reach back into my archives. And I'm going to give you 3 of my favorite guests. These 3 guys are all very clear thinkers, very logical, different personalities, different backgrounds. But at the end of the day, if you sat these 3 men down at a table and had drinks with them, they'd find a way to agree. Maybe they would have completely different experiences. That's not the point. But the way they think, they want to get to the truth. You see, this is not something that's normal in today's society. Finding the truth offends a lot of people. I mean, finding the truth causes a lot of people to break down and cry, literally. Flip on any news show on a daily basis, and you will find people that are crying because they're faced with the truth. The 3 men that I'm about to explore with you, the 3 men that I'm about to go back into my archives with, they don't cry about the truth. They face it head on. And there's a ton to learn from that. My first guest, one of my most favorite people, Salem Abraham, a trader. Salem was in my film. He's been featured in my book, The Complete Turtle Trader. A super interesting guy, super successful. Find everything you can where Salem Abraham is giving insight. I promise you, worth your time. My second guest, Walter Williams, really needs no introduction in the field of economics. You talk about finding truth, Walter goes straight for it. The kind of truth that really does make people cry. That's where Walter lives. Last but not least, my final guest for today is Emmanuel Derman. He is a quant, and I say that most affectionately. A mathematician, physicist. When it comes to looking at financial modeling, financial engineering, he has just a touch of experience, just a touch of insights for all of us. Because sometimes this subject, mathematics, trading, finance, it can get very complicated, and it can be complicated, no doubt about that. But I love clear voices like Emmanuel, who help to bring us all down to an understanding. Without further delay, let's jump into my 3 guests today. One of my favorites, an archive episode.
Michael, how are you?
Hey, Salem, how are you?
I'm doing well. Good morning. Good afternoon to you. What time is it over there?
I'm at 10:15 p.m.
Wow. So good, almost good night.
Yeah. But this is called podcast dedication. So,
good.
It's a perfect time for chatting and catching up. So, hey, how is economic development in Canadian these days?
Well, with the oil and gas market going off the cliff, it's kind of sliding. So it's, but now it's really been booming the last 6 years or so.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been blowing and going. I guess it took a little bit of a hit in 08, 09, late 08, early 09, but then, that seemed to recover pretty quickly. They kind of transitioned from drilling a lot of natural gas wells to then the oil wells, and now both oil and gas are both low, so they're kind of, they're really, the drilling's slowing down, and everybody's kind of scratching their head. But yeah, but it's still a nice town. It's still good by my standards. So,
well, hey, I miss the bread pudding at your steakhouse down there. So
that is good bread pudding.
It is. I
agree with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's nice. Are you okay? You're doing fine. You're enjoying. Yeah, you're living in Singapore now.
I'm in Saigon right now, in Vietnam right now.
Okay. Now, are you living in Vietnam?
I don't know what the definition is. I've been in Asia for the last 2 years. I essentially did a huge speaking circuit, and I did not plan to stay after 4 months of speaking in 8 or 9 countries and 45 presentations later. I was like, wow, I really don't want to go back to San Diego at this moment.
Yeah.
One thing happens and then the next thing you know. And so it's nice.
Good.
It's nice.
Well, a lot of people really love it over there. I know I have a friend that talks highly of Singapore. And so I know there's a lot of nice places over there to spend time, and it's interesting cultures, and so
yeah, they've really the econ development. They kind of reminds me of the feeling that the boom periods you've seen in Texas, but I would think of even the 1980s booms in America. It somewhat feels like that the kind of just growth. It's exciting.
Good.
Yeah. Let me ask you not the tough question, but the interesting question that I think has probably been something that near and dear to you. I remember having a conversation with you talking about your Euro-dollar lessons from 1987. I think if we bookend that with the Swiss franc, it probably have had to brought back memories, that type of a move, huh?
Yes, absolutely. It did. So October 20th of 87, so I'd been trading for 2 months. And we had the crash on the Monday the 19th, and then on the 20th was a 90-day Euro-dollar interest rate move. It was a 37 standard deviation move based on the prior year's volatility. The Swiss franc move that we had recently was a 45 standard deviation move based on the prior 100-day fall. Yeah, it kind of makes me smile, and it reminds me of a lesson I learned back in 87. Which was, be careful with a lot of standard risk measurements, like standard deviation and variance, when markets are not always, markets, we're applying something to markets, a statistical measurement to markets that is generally applied to things naturally occurring out in the world, like the height of people or the amount of rainfall or, things like that. And so you then come to these markets that sometimes are not completely natural, and certainly the Swiss franc wasn't, and even to some extent the Euro-dollar interest rates weren't. Short-term rates, governments can change, and if people are involved, and it may not be occurring in a normally distributed fashion, and the same with FX exchange rates. So. No, it did, and it reminds me that the other big thing is in these markets, you've got to always be careful and trade small, and not get too far out on a limb because there's a few players out there that can saw off limbs, and you don't want to end up smashing to the ground like it happened. So, and interestingly enough, Michael, I was on the wrong side of both of those trades. I was on the wrong side of the Euro-dollar trade, and back then I was trading a lot bigger because I hadn't quite learned the lesson. So anyhow, that was the worst day of my trading career ever, where I lost half my money in my account. It was a $66,000 account, went to 33 on October 20th of 89 after 2 months into trading. But the lesson was a good one, and it came at a great time in my career because I've never traded an account so small since either. So fortunately, the Swiss franc, it cost our clients and me about 2%. But still, we have had a great month. There were a lot of other things make money. So we're finishing this month up about 4.5% for January of 2015.
It's interesting. You bring up the percent loss on the franc. I can't tell you how many emails I received, I guess, from people that perhaps don't understand generally the systematic quant trend type strategies. So many emails came into me immediately assuming that any leverage employed in the strategies that you employ, your peers, that somehow or another that all these folks had blown up. And I was thinking to myself, like, hold on, how in the world did systematic quant trend type strategies with sound risk management, how are you equating this with FX brokers using 500 to 1 leverage?
Right. Yeah. Swiss franc is one of 60 markets we trade. So, and the one part of one key component of a trend following strategy is broad diversification and small risks across lots of markets. And so, it's very different from people who just trade in say it's just a currency trader, because a currency trader, if you're not diversified, you got to have concentrated positions, and that's the people that can get hurt worse. And we really, for us, our Swiss franc trade was a somewhat large position for us. So, yeah, so it was, and there's no getting out of the way of that kind of move. It's just slaps you upside the head, and you don't, by the time it's over, you've taken your losses. So yeah, no, my guys called me at middle of the night, the trade desk. We've got a 24-hour trade desk, so the folks called me, and we looked at it, and it's a little bit, you've got to prepare for things like that before they happen, and you don't know when they're going to happen. Once every 5 or 10 years, you're going to have a crazy event happen that you just hope you stay out of the way of, and to the best you can. And so a key component is always, take small risks, and they seem tiny, but whenever you get something like that Swiss franc move that happens, even a tiny risk looks big. 2% loss, that's a big loss for us, in a year. That's a big one. It'll show up as one of the worst markets for the year at that. So our best markets are, for the year will be in the, 3% range, and the worst markets are usually in the 2% range. And, and most markets are in a fraction of a percent. You're making 0.5% to 1.5%. And it's like climbing a mountain. You do it a step at a time, and you get there a step at a time. There's no big giant leaps in the way we do things.
But you had to have smiled, though, because 2%, yes, you did not want to lose 2%. But on the flip side, there are people out there that perhaps will go unnamed, or unnamed funds, whatnot, that you and I both know they are sitting there in tatters right now. And I'm not gloating or anything like that. I'm just saying that ordinary risk management strategies have left multiple funds out there, perhaps we'll never know who they are, probably broke.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. If you made a lot of money, you're being quiet, and if you lost a lot of money, you're trying to be quiet, but it's going to be hard, because at some point dead bodies rise to the surface, and people end up seeing it. But no, to me, it made me smile, just the statistics and these risk measurements that you see people apply to markets. And I'm on my 28th year of my career in trading, and I see these people that they bring this nice box of statistical measurements from academia, and they try to apply it to markets. And I'm always like, look, this will work for a while, but there'll be at least once a decade you can throw all that in the trash, and they're going to throw something at you that you say should never ever happen. And just know things that should never ever happen do happen in the markets, and that the markets, particularly, when you get into currencies and short interest rates, those are the two that are the scariest, in that the volatility expansions historically have been the greatest. And you see the importance of risk management from a whole nother level than they taught us in statistics class, and the only way to do it is trade very, very small. And don't get too greedy at any one trade or any one moment. Just always be fearful of those coming along, because they end your career. And so, you always got to smile when a bullet zips over, and you say, okay, that's why we don't stand tall in the markets. We kind of hunker down and don't get too big.
Let me ask you one last little question on this Swiss franc topic. So, an artificially priced market like the franc. And I think the analogy, a dam building up, And so can you talk about the notion of these artificially priced markets? Now, of course, you're not in the business of making predictions, but you structurally also are well aware as to how markets are situated and how governments can participate unexpectedly. Talk about the notion of these artificially priced markets around the globe and how these dams can get built up with a certain amount of pressure.
Well, I like your dam analogy. I used the same analogy recently about a dam because, I was talking about 100-year floods, and statistics, again, are designed to measure, these statistical tools are designed to measure naturally occurring events or situations. And so it would work with, say, a 100-year flood, and you would say, okay, well, 3 standard deviations and this kind of thing. And, 99.7% of occurrences should be inside of 3 standard deviations. And it changes when you get people interfering in a naturally occurring event. It's very similar to if you build a dam. And so if you build a dam on a river and then the dam breaks, it's a very different flood than the 100-year flood that would have occurred. And it's much more catastrophic. And I think, in the markets we see that, in, the interest rates with, the central banks around the globe, they've got the interest rates in a headlock and they feel pretty confident they can control those interest rates. But, we've all seen markets where central governments tried to control things and they didn't do a very good job, or they did a good job up to a point and then it broke loose. And that's what happened on the Swiss franc. I mean, the bankers here at Swiss National Bank had to be sitting around as they're printing these Swiss francs, trying to keep their currency weak. And it must have seemed really silly, the quantity of Swiss francs they're printing, and they just look at each other and they say, we just can't keep this up. And then you break the dam. Then how do you break a dam? How do you once you've got all this water backed up, there's not an easy way to let it go. There's a lot of ugly ways to let it go. And so they just picked the easiest one and just walked away and let the whole thing collapse. And, it's dangerous for traders when you've got people interfering with markets. And, most markets you don't have that. You get markets like, say, the grain markets or cocoa or the metals or energy markets, they just swing around and they're wild all the time. But you get someone with a market in a headlock and everyone gets lulled into this sense of complacency that, oh yeah, this isn't very volatile. But you got to be careful. It's kind of like dynamite. Dynamite's not volatile till it goes off, and then then watch out. Yeah, so it just sits there, looks real innocent until boom. And so that was the Swiss franc, and it was interesting in '87, the crash of '87. That when your dollars, that was central banks moving interest rates, dropping. They lowered interest rates, but to help flood the market with liquidity after the crash, on October 19th, and so, it wasn't quite the same deal, but it was in that they went and had a big splash too with doing a move that should statistically never ever happen. And we certainly see other dams built up out there that you've got to say, okay, be careful of those. Same thing can happen there.
I want to jump into in a few minutes here, just some background stuff and lessons learned and wisdom you can impart to the audience. But there's one other market move that I think is really interesting to talk about. Crude oil, basically since last year, a fantastic trend, at least if one's on the right side of it. But I think what's really interesting, you're a dyed-in-the-wool speculator. You are a speculator. That's what, your business is about, speculation. And of course, running a money management business and helping clients, but at the root, it's speculation. And speculators often get an awful name in the press and whatnot. But this time around for oil, I don't hear people coming out and saying, well, gosh, thank you for the speculators for making our gas cheaper at the pump.
Yeah, no, and for the most part, you had a lot of, certainly the trend following community, they were short energy markets, and no one sent a thank you note. They were sure trying to villainize everybody when it was going up. And what I always tell people, and I think if you really think about what happens in a market, I think if we start with the premise that a market is driven by supply and demand, and if everyone can agree on that, you say, okay, which I think we can, because I think that's true. If the supply of a market and the demand of a market, that's what ultimately determines the price. Well, and to affect the supply, you have to, if there's some shortage of them, let's say, for instance, let's talk about crude oil back when it was going up. If there's a shortage of it, then someone must have taken that supply. And to take the supply, someone either has to consume it or they have to hoard it. Those are the two ways to take supply off the market. In order to consume it and hoard it, you have to take delivery of it. And if you see people in the futures markets, speculators, they don't take delivery. They roll forward. It's really silly for people to say, well, it's all your fault. And I would say speculators could push a market for a day, maybe a week, but eventually that contract comes up to maturity and they've got to sell it. In the end, they just held it for a bit. Say, you look at times when people have manipulated markets and cornered markets. If you ever corner a market, you've got to stay in the corner with the market. You can't walk away with money because then you've got to sell. You only make a profit. You got to buy and then sell. And if you ever corner a market by buying, then you ultimately have to sell to make money, and you can't artificially create demand or artificially hurt supply if you never consume it or hoard it in a long-term way. And so speculators changing the market, it just doesn't happen. It really, it happens on a very short-term basis. There are moves that are fundamentally, there's a reason for them to happen. They happen, and speculators get in and they participate in it to a degree, but to make a profit, you've got to sell to someone else that wanted it worse than you. And the speculators are not selling to always other speculators. They're selling to people that really want to use the product. And so, anyhow, it's a silly argument that you hear lots of times from people that don't understand markets and they want to blame someone for a movement. But like you say, they certainly never go give credit to anybody when it moves the way they like it to move. But at the end of the day, you can try to educate people, but you can't fix stupid. And some people are intent on being stupid and they don't want to be educated and they don't want to take the time to learn. And that's a harsh way to put it, but that's just, that's what you see.
Let me take you back a step as you mentioned learning, and you're a guy that was fortunate enough to have some really interesting mentors early on. And I think one of the most interesting mentors, and we've talked about this in the past, was your grandfather. And I would love for you just to, reaching back into memory and impart some of the wisdom to the audience that your grandfather was able to impart to you just about life and markets. And because I'm sure you probably think back every day and think, well, gosh, this guy's has a good part of my success and he helping me to learn and think the right way.
I was really blessed to get to work with my grandfather and for 6.5 years before he passed away, which has been almost 21 years ago. He's been gone a long time, but he was a very successful business person and doing, deals mostly and one of the things, I think one of the best lessons he taught me for anybody in business is we were doing some land speculation. So we would buy, it's almost like, and this was in the 80s when the oil and gas boom of the 80s had gone completely off the tracks and a lot of land was being sold cheaply. And so being in the country, we were buying distressed real estate, but it's ranch land, and a lot of people in the housing world are doing that in housing, kind of fix and flip crowd. It was basically the country boy version of that, but you do ranches. And we liked ranch land, and my brothers were involved in ranch land. Well, so there were deals that we had the opportunity to buy into some deals, and they were probably, 85, 90 cents on the dollar. And I really wanted to do those. And he said, no. And I said, look, we could make some money off this. And he said, yeah, but I said, look, we don't want to do good deals. We want to do great deals. I said, don't do good deals, because when you do good deals, you tie up your time and your energy and your money. And when the great deals come along, you don't have time for the great deals. And you don't have the money for the great deals. So you got to keep your powder dry for the great deals. The patience he had, and as a young person, I was anxious to do something. And he laughed and he said, you need to get a hobby. Relax a minute. Wait. Just, wait for the great deals. And he was right, because, a few months later, a deal comes along that's, 60 or 50 cents on 50 to 60 cents on the dollar. It's actually 50 cents on the dollar. This one deal came along and a bank had some property and they had to unload it fast and they were looking for someone with cash and we had it. And so not doing good deals was interesting advice, but really great advice. And you see that resonate with other people. I know Warren Buffett, a terrific investor, he was he's talked about, if you can do 10 great deals in your lifetime, this, like a coupon book, I think he describes it as. So great deals, that's one. Certainly the other big one that, and the very first thing he told me when I showed up is, just the importance of honesty and ethics and treating people right. The world's built in a circle, and you got to go treating people badly. Then at the end of the day, that all comes back to you, and you're not going to be in business very long. And it costs you in the short run to do the right thing, but it pays big dividends in the long run, and to demonstrate to people you're trustworthy. Those are probably two of the best ones that, he had. Now, I will say he tried to do deals with a lot of optionality to them, where the risk reward, and I would say it's similar to trend following in that where you limit your losses and have the opportunity for big profits. He would do that with options, where he would, make a deal where he pays an amount, just like an option premium, and then he's got this upside that he sees it's a lopsided return with a limited risk, and where you control that downside, and that's certainly something that transcends from the business world to the trading world. But so does, certainly honesty and ethics. That's important as well. And so, and even the importance of the big deals, that's, you see that in trend following. That's where you make your money, is some of these nice big moves. You make it in lots of little places, but these bigger moves, if you can get a handful of nice moves that, 2-3% moves that give you 10 to 15% a year, you say, hey, that's a good year. And I was really fortunate and very blessed to get to work with him.
Going back in time and going back to think about your grandfather, but I'm curious, in current day, what influences you today, your thinking, your business decisions, whether it's new voices or thought leaders, books, what types of influences affect your decision making today? What new things do you like to learn today? I'm giving you the hard question right now in the middle of the interview.
That's all right. Well, I love to read, and the other day I read on the plane, 0 to 1 was an interesting, you read these books from smart people like, that's Peter Thiel, and I like reading about people who've done it. I think that's what's interesting about what you do, Michael, too, is I think to listen and to talk to people who've done it. There's a lot of people that will come up and say, hey, let me tell you how to do this, but they really haven't done it. And anytime I can learn from people who've had interesting experiences and have done fascinating, amazing things, and that's fun to read about. And that's where, like I said, that book, that Peter Thiel, that's just one of many examples. But he's done some interesting investing and analyzing businesses and what works, what doesn't. And so, anytime you can study from people who've demonstrated they can repeat success, there's sometimes the one-hit wonders that you go, well, I don't know if that was just one lucky, got a hunch, bet a bunch, and then you're out. You see that sometimes. But sometimes a lot of times you'll see people that you say, all right, these people have demonstrated repeated success, and they've got something that they've got some ideas or concepts that seem to work. And so anytime I can do that, I like the old, the Market Wizard books Jack Swagger used to do. Those were interesting way back. What you're doing, where you talk to traders that have done it, all that. And to talk with other traders, that's always fun and interesting to see different people doing different things. And, at the end of the day, some people, they're doing something that I may never like to do. It just doesn't fit my personality. But it's still fascinating to hear about it. And you've got to respect success wherever you find it, whether it's in the investing world or in an athletic endeavor or in the arts or whatever. You see people that are that really seem to connect and have an understanding, and that's fun it's fun to just at least learn about what they're doing and what they're thinking.
I always give you a shout out because the one thing that, here I am in Asia right now, but what I think I really learned from meeting you and seeing your home, your office, was the location independence. And you had that feeling and thought as a young man, but I don't think a lot of people necessarily have that. And you chose to be in your hometown, but I, coming to your hometown, just said, well, hold on. This just means you could be anywhere. That was an awesome lesson I got from going to Canadian Texas to actually give me the confidence to say, well, gosh, I could be in Asia. Why not? And people might find that funny, but it's true. It's the location independence aspect.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, all you need is some way to connect to the outside world. It was, our town in Texas is somewhat a typical Western town where the railroad came through, and the railroad came in 1887 to our town, and that's why the town of Canadian Texas, that's why the town's here, and that's where the railroad was the link to the outside world. And today the link is either a satellite link or phone link, and so the links are not as expensive to build as they used to be back in the 1880s with railroads. But that link to the outside world, whether it was, in the Old West, the railroad, or today with satellites and phones and internet connections, yeah, it's easier today. And it's that same link, you need a link to the outside world. And and it's easy to get that from a remote location, whether it's a small town in Asia or a small town in Texas. Most of them have a link to the outside world. And once you have that, you can do a lot. I think you can do anything, particularly in the trading world. Why not?
Yeah.
And what I found, I like being a little bit removed from all the noise, and I can sit and study and run my numbers and see what I'm wanting to do. It's kind of like studying in a quiet room, or do you want to study in, Grand Central Station? And if I'm studying and really trying to think, I like a nice quiet place, and I don't need the distractions. So Canadian serves as that. It's really a nice place to study and work, and then I've got that connection and hit a few keystrokes and make some trades. And so, no, you're right. You don't have to be in the middle of Manhattan or Chicago. And to me, it would be a distraction. There's too many things going on that would get my attention, and I'd just say, nah, let me just get out where there's not a lot of noise and not a lot of people, and I can think clearly. So, and good fresh air. So,
yeah. Hey, as we wind down here, let me get like one kind of last question about the markets trading. So you've got a strategy that really, one of the key features is it's a strategy that's designed to the best that you can to avoid disaster. And we were talking about it early in the conversation. But talk about the notion of, so here you have this well thought out strategy, very quantitative driven. You want to avoid disaster. But on the other side of the ledger, you have so many people that have been long the S&P since March of 2009, and they just say, well, I don't need all that stuff, Salem. What disaster? What are you talking about? Look what the S&P, it's gone straight up. I don't need all the exits and the risk management and the disaster protection. It's always got to be a constant struggle with a strategy that is designed to protect against disaster. And there's no guarantees to anything, but you're always thinking about that. Whereas I think many people in the investment community, and of course you have many peers that think like you do, but many people in the investment community and their clients don't often think of disaster as one of the most important things. And I'm not trying to be a negative guy either as I bring this up.
No, I think you're right. I think people are conditioned they think they have to have, the stock market they've got to have a lot of money in it, and they don't, and they're somehow say, well, we're going to have periods where we lose a lot of money in this market. And I look back at history, and history's important. I mean, history gives you an idea of at least none of us can see tomorrow. We don't even know tomorrow, let alone next year or the next decade. But certainly we can look back in history. And in the very recent history, even 08 and 87, back to, the crash in 1929 in stocks will occasionally hand you a loss in the 30% range, somewhere 20 to 40%. That's not uncommon for once, every now and then to get that kind of a loss in stocks. And I think somehow people think, well, this is just what we're supposed to do. And it's like not wishing for something that could be better. And then also they think in the way of diversification, what I see too, they do this diversification, have this diversification idea that, well, we want to diversify. On average, we want to be diversified. And so they get this big correlation matrix and they look at, say, monthly returns over time, and they say, well, I'm going to be long this stock, and then I'm, whether it's value and growth or different, emerging markets or venture capital and all these different equity components. But at the end of the day, they're all equity and they're all business. And when the world has a big economic downturn, they all go down. And so they say, well, on average, they're not diversified. But then when the whole thing, when the economy really tanks, they suddenly, people have this thing, well, there's sometimes the correlations all go to one. Well, you say, well, yeah, if so many of these investments are along the economy and they get smashed occasionally. And then you see what we do and you look historically for us. I mean, we haven't been for hundreds of years, but almost 30 years, and our worst year is down, 10.9%. And you think, well, that's not as painful as 30. And then two, you see that we can make money when everything does go down, like in 2008, where we made 30%, and a lot of people in the managed future space, I think the average was up about 15%. And so you see this huge opportunity for diversification. And what I always say is, it's diversification when you need it. A seatbelt that works every day except when you have a wreck. You're like, well, is that really a good seatbelt? If it doesn't work in the wrecks, and who cares if it's working on the average day when I'm not having a wreck? And you say a diversification model of all these different things that are along the economy where, all these equity components that occasionally get smashed, and you say, well, I'm diversified though, it works. It says, yeah, but you're not diversified when you really need it. When you really need it, everything you have all this pain. Why do you want a diversification model that in the wrecks doesn't work? I mean, does that really make sense to anybody? It doesn't make sense to me. I want something that, I want to look at when things all fall off the tracks and we have a really big economic downturn. What are the things I can be involved in and invested in that have a chance of making money and that are not going to get drugged down by this economic collapse or downturn? And that's where it's hard to find. It's a short list of things. Managed futures, though, are on that list. I think managed futures, I think you see global macro, which is really a kissing cousin of managed futures. It's the same kind of thing. Those strategies in the hedge fund space can do well. And I think people doing this type of trading, they can also do well. They can, there's opportunities to make money when everything's going down. In '08, people say, well, how do you make 30% in '08? I said, well, we were short, our biggest trades, which are not big trades like we've talked about, short nickel, zinc, and orange juice. And most people didn't make money with nickel, zinc, and orange juice going down in '08. And then, even in 2014, we were up 21%. We had a great year, but we made money. Our biggest money makers were in the meat markets. We were long the cattle and long the hogs, and then long milk. Those were some. Now the 10-year rates made us some money, and we made some money in currencies too. And so a lot of different things. But it's interesting with long hogs and long milk were two of our big winners last year. Well, this month we're short hogs and short milk, and milk has been a break even this month, but hogs is one of our best money makers this month, and now we're short. And so it just helps illustrate the point that, hey, things up, things down, we don't care, things moving, that's what we want. And when things are moving, there's opportunity to make money, and that gives us also, does the economy going down hurt or help? We're like, well, actually, if the economy really tanks big, it's probably going to be a nice big move. And nice big moves we can make money off of, like '08. It's a great diversifier. It is funny how people somehow want to accept a 30% drawdown in one investment class, and they're happy to put 60% of their money in it. But then they look at futures and they say, oh, it's risky. And you say, well, it doesn't have to be risky if you trade it right. Just like a Lamborghini. A Lamborghini can drive around 5 miles an hour everywhere. And just because it can go 200 doesn't mean you have to drive at 200. And the same with futures. It's got huge leverage, and that tends to scare people, the opportunity for leverage. But I mean, it's truly like driving a Lamborghini at 5 miles an hour. And people, we just don't use the leverage. It's like, well, it's got a lot of speed there. We could use it, but it's dangerous to drive fast. We don't like to drive fast. I think it's a good point. I think you make a good point, though. People should look harder at managed futures and the opportunities. And I think they're beginning to. You see more and more people, even big institutions, looking at it and seeing the opportunity for diversification. So hopefully that continues.
I think some people, maybe they want to make money in a certain market, and you wake up each day and you say, hold on, I'm going to manage my risk. I'm prepared to make money from whatever market moves in the direction that I'm going right, or the direction, following along the direction of that market. So, but you're agnostic. You're not waking up and saying, I must make my money in Apple. I must make my money in Google. You're not doing that.
Right. No. People ask me, well, what do you think's going to be the big markets in 2015? I'm like, I've got no idea. I said, but I'm ready. You've got to be there ready. And like you say, do we care? No. Do we care up or down? No. We care that there's some movement in a market someplace that we can see taking place and jump on board. And so, yeah, it was last year, meats and milk and some currencies. What's this coming year? Who knows? And the energy market's down. Maybe energy market's up. Maybe we have a drought. Maybe, in 1988, huge drought, grain prices doubled. Maybe, who knows? Maybe it's something in the softs. Maybe it's orange juice. There was a year orange juice and base metals made me most of my money. It can be anywhere. You're right. And it can be up or down. And I've made, having done this so long, I've made it lots of different markets and every up, direction's up, direction's down. It really is. You're not limited to one space. And you mentioned like the currency traders earlier. Some people some people even in the futures markets will limit their space to one sector. You get people that just trade energy, so just trade currencies, and that to me is tricky. You're like, well, if you're just trading, say, energies, what if the move's in grains, or what if it's in cocoa or sugar or coffee or the metals? Or so we trade 60 markets. We're looking for 5 to 10 good ones every year that are really going to shine, and that's all we need. But you want to kind of have a big group in the room that you can say, all right, who's feeling like doing a big move this year, and that's what you need to make your year. Question:
Have you, as we kind of close out here, have you visited this part of the world? Have you been over to Asia yet?
I have. I went to, I have 8 kids, so we've got a whole tour group all in our own family with 10 of us. So 8 kids and my wife and I. So we went to China. It's been 3 years ago, and we did a big 20-day tour of China, and it was an amazing trip. We really had a great time, and wonderful people, interesting economy, and the things that people are doing, and a fascinating area. Would love to see more of Asia, because I know there's a lot of other places outside of China that are doing fascinating things. I know, like where you've been in Vietnam and Singapore and different places.
Once you see China like that, though, unless you're talking to another American that's seen what you've seen, it's almost hard to explain what you see on the ground, isn't it?
Oh, I agree. Well, you see what's in the news, and the news is not everything. The news is the interesting things or the shocking things going on, but the real life is everything. And so I think that the keyhole of the news stations is not the keyhole. That's not the full picture. And so to go meet people and to talk to them and to go in their house and eat, we would go and eat dinner with them and talk to them and understand what what they do every day and where they go to work and what their routine is and where they shop, go to the grocery stores, which they don't have. They have these markets, and you go and you buy things there, and it's fascinating. And it's just, you see their way of life and what they're doing, and then you have a better understanding of, okay, I see what's happening here. And, certainly with the number of people in Asia, they are a big factor in the world and what they're doing. And it's like our family of 10. If we come eat dinner at your house, or if a family, of 3 come over, it's a different, different environment. You got a lot going on with a family of 10, and you got a lot going on in Asia with a lot of people. And with a lot of people, you can have some interesting things happen. So no, it's fascinating. I know you're having an interesting time over there.
I got to share with you one quick thing that you would love to hear. So last 13, I had a chance to present to, I think, 5 of the top 10 largest Chinese mutual funds in their offices in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. I think it was in Beijing. It was China Asset Management, which I think is the biggest. And so I'm in a room giving a trend following presentation to 30 guys. And of course, you're in a money management facility like that in Beijing. These are probably the smartest guys, some of the smartest guys and gals in China, in the room, and there's we're using a translator, so they're not giving any indication of English. Okay, when I've done the presentation after 45 minutes, all of a sudden I start getting peppered with questions in perfect English, right? And the funny thing is they all knew about this one Chinese investor who had made billions, and his whole strategy was buying right as markets were about to kind of lock limit. And so they were all, it was traveling around and giving presentations in all the different countries. China was the one country where they really seemed to have this idea of buying strength and selling weakness, a deep understanding and appreciation of it. They had known other Chinese investors, kind of a modified type trend following strategy, but they really got it. It's going to be interesting to see how things unfold.
You bet. Well, you see in China, I was always amazed at the interest in really entrepreneurship and business, and from the farmer that's out with his little plot of land, or someone that's doing something in the cities. There's a lot of entrepreneurs in China. That entrepreneur mindset is alive and well, and people tend to think, well, this is a communist country, and I'm like, you go grassroots. This is a country of entrepreneurs, and so I could see that, and I could see they're fascinated with markets, and there's a lot of very interesting people there, and like you say, a lot of smart people, smart people.
Yeah.
When as a statistician, I know if you have 10 people and you find the smartest person out of 10 or the smartest person out of 1,000, you're going to get probably a smarter person out of 1,000. Just you've got the odds of a really unusually smart person, and so when they go pick out the smartest of their bunch, they got some really smart folks that are, I'm sure, going to be doing some interesting things going forward. And so, and very friendly people, and really, we felt, we were very welcomed there. Yeah, it was fun.
Well, thanks again for coming on, Salem. I appreciate it. It's been a while since we chatted. Hey, Asian Godfathers by Joe Studwell. Great book to read about the development of various parts of Asia. Great stuff. But hey, thank you for coming on today. And, hopefully we can catch up again in the not too distant future. And I think people always love hearing your wisdom, and you got great experiences and a lot to learn from. Appreciate it.
Great, Michael. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to visit with you. I appreciate it.
Now for my second guest on this mega archive episode, Walter Williams. Here's where I want to start with something kind of fun. I'm jealous. I'm envious. I want to intellectually steal something from you, and it's what you describe yourself as. And I just love this. You call yourself a radical. It's not fair. That's not fair if you do that first. I love it.
Okay.
Why do you call yourself a radical?
Well, because my vision's part company with most people. Most people believe that one person should be forcibly used to serve the purposes of another, and so and that includes welfare stands, business bailouts, and all this kind of stuff. And I disagree with that position.
So let me jump into something specific: the morality of markets. A lot of people that don't understand markets and the benefits of markets often get upset when they contemplate the idea that there's a loser. But there's often a zero-sum nature of markets. And how do people get so confused on how markets can be a negative thing? Good, fair, honest markets. I'm not talking about crony capitalism or bailouts of banks, but good, honest markets. How can there be something bad about that?
Well, I think people don't understand, and they've been miseducated, and they've been subject to a lot of propaganda. Now, when I talk about the morality of markets, or when I make the case for the morality of markets, I don't start off talking about markets. I make the assumption that I, Walter Williams, am my property. I belong to myself, and you belong to yourself. And so when you start off with the basic assumption that each of us owns ourselves, then certain acts are immoral and other acts are moral. For example, the reason why murder is immoral is because it violates private property rights. Rape is immoral. It violates private property rights. And so is theft. Theft is immoral because it violates private property rights. Now, a free market, the system of a free market or institution of a free market, acknowledges the fact that people own themselves. Now, so if I own myself, then I have the right to engage in peaceable, voluntary exchange with anyone else. That is, if I want to buy tomatoes from you, then it's my business and it's your business, and it's no right of a third party to come in and say, well, no, we're going to cancel that exchange, or we think that it's better that Walter Williams buys tomatoes from an American producer. And so I think that the basis for arguing for a free market lies in the moral philosophy that was spoken about by John Locke centuries ago. You know, that the idea of self ownership, and self ownership means just many things. That is, self ownership means that you cannot be forced to serve the purposes of somebody else. And this is what government welfare programs are, or government bailout programs. They're forcing one person to serve the purposes of another. Now, forcing one person to serve the purposes of another, that's a working definition for slavery. Mm. That is because slavery forces one person to serve the purposes of another, forcibly uses them. And so does the welfare state. It forcibly, the money, in other words, the money that government uses for food stamps, bailouts, it doesn't come from the Tooth Fairy. It doesn't come from Santa Claus. The only way that government can give one American citizen $1, or any citizen anywhere, money, but give one American, since I'm talking about America, to give one American $1, it must forcibly take that $1 from somebody else. That is some other American. That is, government cannot give one American citizen $1 without first taking that $1 from some other American. And so when you take that $1 from some other American, you are forcing him to serve the purpose of somebody else.
Very clear. And I know you're one of your maybe if not your largest motivation is as an educator to teach. But I think it would be good for my audience. I know many of my audience are going to be familiar with you. But born 1936, Philadelphia. And I've seen you describe yourself, your family, to say, we were poor, but we didn't think that way. And that's such a brilliant piece of advice. Even if it was just a description of your situation, it's still brilliant advice. Why don't you talk about the idea that you didn't think you were poor? You didn't think poor.
Well, my mother used to say, she used to tell us that we have a beer pocketbook, but we have champagne taste. And that is, matter of fact, I'm born in 1936, and back then, if you called somebody poor, that was an insult, because we didn't think of ourselves as poor people. We thought of ourselves as struggling people trying to do better. And matter of fact, the values at that time were much different from the values today, and particularly among black people. That is, we did not have the welfare mentality. We did not buy into the welfare state. Some of the pathology that you see today was completely absent in the 30s and 40s, when I was in the 50s, when I was growing up. And when I talk about particular pathology, the high illegitimacy rate among black Americans of over 70%, I think it's close to 75%. Well, back in the 1940s, it was like 12 or 13%. And, or the breakup of the family. And and matter of fact, back in the 1870s, 70-some% of black kids lived in two-parent families, compared to today, when somewhere around only 30% of black kids live in two-parent families, and in some cities, such as New York City, it's far less than that. And so, I think that when we were coming up, there was a different attitude. There was pride. I mean, to tell somebody, the one way to insult your friend is to say your mother's on relief, and that was that's what we called welfare back then. And to be on relief was an insult. And matter of fact, my stepfather used to always tell me that any kind of job is better than begging and stealing. Now, that's not the attitude for people today. A lot of people say, "Look, I'm not going to work at McDonald's for $7 an hour. I'd much rather be on welfare. I'd much rather be begging for money."
In fact, you bring up working at McDonald's, and I'd like for you to go into your description, your explanation about the idea of minimum wage. And I think for a lot of people, they hear about minimum wage and maybe they have some money or they have some success, and the idea of minimum wage it sounds noble. It sounds beneficial to those that don't have. However, I think there's something more nefarious about minimum wage, and I'd like for you to expand on that.
Well, I think that most people support the minimum wage out of good intentions. They want their fellow man to have a higher wage, to be better off. And that's a fairly decent motivation. But when one has policy, when one forms public policy, he shouldn't pay attention to the intentions behind the public policy. He should ask, what is the effect of public policy? What is the effect of the minimum wage? And you see the effect of the minimum wage if you put yourself in the place of an employer, and you must pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire. And actually, $7.25 an hour is not your minimum cost, because you have to pay mandated benefits such as Social Security, unemployment compensation, and other fringes. But let's stick with $7.25, the current minimum wage in the United States. Now, if you must pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire, will you hire that worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that will only enable him to produce $4 worth of value per hour? In other words, would you pay somebody $7.25 when that somebody can only produce $4 worth of value? Well, most employers would look at that as a losing economic proposition. So they just would not hire such a person. And who are these people? Well, it's a low-skilled worker. The minimum wage law, one of the first effects of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled workers. And it turns out in most economies, the lowest skilled workers are teenagers. They have low skills because they lack the experience and work attitudes and other attributes of adults. And among that number are black teenagers who not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of going to rotten schools, very often living in broken families and pathological neighborhoods. And so if you were predicting who would the greater unemployment effects of the minimum wage law, you would say, well, gee, it would have a devastating impact on the employment opportunities for teenagers, and doubly so on minority teenagers. And if you look at the empirical data, that's what it shows. One thing that people don't know, I did a study called Youth and Minority Unemployment for the Joint Economic Committee of Congress in 1976 or 78, somewhere around there. And in 1948, black teenage unemployment was 9.4%. White teenage unemployment was 10.2%. Compared to today, white teenage unemployment is around 20-some percent, and black teenage unemployment is over 40%. And the labor force participation rates of blacks were greater during the 40s and 50s than whites. That is, labor force participation means that blacks were more active in the labor market than were white teenagers. And today, it's entirely the opposite. Now, there's one other thing about the minimum wage law that people don't understand. It destroys employment opportunities. Again, when I was a kid, when you pull into a gasoline station, there was a youngster to wash your windows, check the air in your tire, and maybe check your hood. Now today they're self-service stations, and they're not self-service stations today because Americans love to smell gasoline fumes while they're gassing up the cars. Or another example of a job disappeared when I was a youngster. There were in movie theaters that had ushers to show you to your seat. Today there are no ushers in movie theaters, and it's not because Americans that they like to stumble down the aisles in the dark to find their seat. And just one other effect of the minimum wage, other than destroying jobs and causing premature automation, minimum wages are one of the most effective tools in the arsenal of racists everywhere around the world. In 1989, I wrote a book called South Africa's War Against Capitalism, so I did a study of labor markets in South Africa, and I found that, and I give many, many quotes in the book, of racist labor unions, South Africa racist labor unions, that would never have a black as a member, were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated reason was to make the wages so high for blacks that they would not be hired. And you see the motivation, that is, companies would hire a laborer, and they had to pay a white guy. I think this is like 1980 statistics. They might have to pay a white worker $3 an hour, but they get away hiring a black for 50 cents an hour to do the same job. So you see the incentive of the contractors was to hire blacks. Now, if the white workers could force the black wages closer to $3, then it would be reduced incentive for contractors to hire black workers.
You know, Dr. Williams, you surely faced discrimination at various points in your life, but you are one of the most positive, and it's one of the reasons I want to have you on. You're one of those positive, inspiring people, and you just want to listen. And I think this is why millions of people, when they hear you on the radio, maybe filling in for Rush or something, they just love you. But how did you avoid bitterness? Like, why did you stay so positive, even when you probably had to face issues that as a white kid that I didn't have to face growing up? How did you stay so positive?
I don't know. I think I think that one of the things that's different about our country that was not around today and not around in yesteryear is that people were concerned about, people today are concerned about people's self-esteem. They're concerned about not hurting anyone's feelings by telling them the truth. They want like if they've had handicaps, they want special privileges or special help. Now, when I was a youngster, my mother used to tell me, look, Walter, there is discrimination. There's racial discrimination. And you know what that means? It means that you have to be better. You have to try harder. And that's the kind of lessons I got. Or with my stepfather, he would say, look, if you want to make it in this world, you have to learn to come early and stay late. And so those were the kind of values that I grew up with, and being bitter about something doesn't help out at all. I mean, that is the way you get even, if you're concerned with getting even, is to work hard and accomplish more. And today that is not quite the attitude. People think, well, there should be some kind of compensation for slavery. There should be some kind of consideration for years of injustice that black people suffered, and this kind of thing, taken into consideration, the discrimination and handicaps that blacks have had has been devastating. That is where professors in colleges, black students are admitted to colleges on much lower standards than white students. Sometimes when they're in college, professors give them a break, give them a C, or give them a B when they should get an F in the class, and those kind of things, that kind of treatment does not help. And so anyway, I just don't share the philosophy that many people share today, both black and white, I might add.
You know, some in the audience might be thinking, well, you know, you sound like part of the establishment. Other people have had a harder time. But if I look back at some of, in preparing to speak with you today, you had a fondness more for Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King. So you were willing to fight even more.
Oh yes. And I might say that a black person living today, he has not seen things that I've seen, things like signs posted, colored waiting room, colored water fountain, colored entrance, and he has not seen any lynching and all of these horrible things that's part of our history. And matter of fact, the average poor black person, or the average poor American in general, you have statistics like 60-some% of them own at least one car. That the people that the Census Department defines as poor, 60-some% of them own at least one car, and 14% two or more cars. Poor people have 90-some% of poor people have microwaves. They have a large number have cable TVs. The average poor person has more living space to live in than middle class people in Europe and other parts of the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia. And so poverty today is, and there's no poverty in the United States. That is, there's no material poverty in the United States, because poor people are much better off than they were in the 40s and 50s. Now, what we do have is spiritual poverty of the spirit, where people have adopted certain kinds of pathological lifestyles, dependency, crime, illegitimacy, family breakdown. And these are devastating things, but it's no more material poverty, and not the kind of material poverty that I saw. For example, my wife, she was the youngest of 11 children. And her father, we're both young. I'm 78, and my wife, if she were still alive, she'd be 81. But her father used to have to move his family into abandoned buildings and maybe jury-rig the electricity so they can have some light and maybe some heat. Now, you don't find that kind of stuff going on today in the United States.
Yeah, speaking of jerry-rigging, I can walk out my door here in Saigon and I can see the jerry-rigging of the wires just about everywhere. It's quite different. Hey, let me shift into a bigger picture issue. So how did you feel as an economist, a free market mindset, in the fall of 2008 when the Fed, government officials decided to let Bear Stearns go under, let Lehman Brothers go under, but then they saved Goldman Sachs. They saved Morgan Stanley. And I think, sometimes people on the right want to always say about critics of, they want to criticize the left. They say, hey, we want to do away with welfare. But you know what? I have a big problem with Goldman Sachs welfare. I have a big problem with Morgan Stanley welfare. And I think sometimes that gets glossed over. How did you feel when you realized we were bailing out speculative ventures in the fall of 2008? It wasn't a good thing, was it?
Well, no, it was not. I think that if you want to find the question why Goldman Sachs, the big financial firms are bailed out, you look at who was the ex-Secretary of Treasury and the kind of impact they had in Washington, and that's why they got bailed out. But I think that what bailing out does, it conceals a lot of the foolhardiness of previous administrations, namely the Bush administration, with the idea that everybody should be a homeowner, and they were keeping interest rates artificially low. And when you keep interest rates artificially low, it gives people incentives to invest when they should not invest in buying a house and in buying a business. And there's a comeuppance to it, and that comeuppance came in 2007, 2008, when people began to question the worthiness of all this debt that had been created, and in the housing market was devastating. That is, they were making liar loans. That is, banks were knowingly giving mortgages to people who could not afford it. But what the hell did the bank care? Because Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae and the Federal Reserve was buying the paper, and so it just got them off it gets everybody off the hook. And you're absolutely right that handouts to wealthy people is just as bad as handouts to poor people. There's no justification for either.
Yeah, I agree completely. Big picture, to me, if I look at my home country, I don't know if I see left and right anymore. I sort of see one group of people that wants the state to take care of a lot of things, and the other group just says, state, go away. And I don't know what the percentages are. To me, it feels like the numbers and percentages of people that want the state to step in and handle everything just seems to be growing. And I think the issue that troubles me is like, how did people come to have this much respect for bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.? I mean, you and I know, for example, how much wealth has been created in the Northern Virginia area in real estate. And it's not the result of free market economics. It's the result of government employees that get guaranteed salaries and they make a ton of money and they jack these prices up. But how did we get to this point where people want to trust the state so much? What triggered? What went wrong?
Well, it's fairly difficult for me to put my finger on any one source, but I think that if you had to tie down to a bedrock cause, I would say it's a result of a generalized contempt and disrespect for the United States Constitution. That is, what the average American wants Congress to do things that for which there's no constitutional authority for Congress to do. For example, to give you an idea, James Madison is the acknowledged father of the Constitution. So you kind of guess that James Madison would know what's in the Constitution. And in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. And James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate. And he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, and these quotes are on my website, walterewilliams.com. James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence. Now, if you look at the federal budget today, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. Madison also said that charity is not a legitimate function of government. Now, you take a politician today running for office, wanting to be the president of the country, like James Madison, and if he said during his campaign that charity is not a legitimate function of government, if he said that what James Madison said, he can't find anything in the Constitution to authorize spending for the purpose of benevolence, that person would never be elected to office by the American people. The American people would have just contempt for an idea that government should not be in the business of helping should not be in business of giving one person's earnings to another person. And any senator running for office or a congressman saying the same thing, he'd be run out of town on a rail. That is, if I were the senator running for the Senate in any state, conservative or liberal state, and say Virginia, and I'm running for the Senate in Virginia, and I go back and forth across the country, and I say, look, my fellow Virginians, I've read the United States Constitution, and I'm going to respect the Constitution. So if you elect me to office, don't expect for me to bring back highway construction funds, aid to higher education, Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. I would not get elected to office by the citizens of Virginia. The tragedy is that Virginians would be acting exactly right by not electing me to office, by electing me to the Senate. Why? Because if I don't bring back billions and billions of dollars for the citizens of Virginia, that doesn't mean that Virginians will pay a lower federal income tax. All that it means is that Maryland will get it instead. That is, once legalized theft begins, it pays for everybody to participate in it, and those who do not participate in it are going to wind up as losers because they will not benefit. There's no benefit whatsoever except moral satisfaction, but there's no financial, economic benefit from people not participating in the handout game, and that's the tragedy of it.
Yeah, and I don't see how that shifts anytime soon. I think
and so what I'm saying, if you're expecting for it to shift, look, I've asked people, I say, is there any difference? Is there any basic human difference between Americans and Romans, Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, and the English? These are great empires of the past, but they went down the tubes for precisely what we're doing. And so, is there anything to exempt us from what happened to these other great nations of the past? And I reluctantly observe no, because we have lost our love in our nation. We've lost our love for liberty. And the true tragedy of liberty failing in the United States, because if liberty is lost in the United States, I believe that it will be lost all times and all places forever.
Something strong for people to think about. I think it's, I share your view. I think you've made a strong case for it. Hey, I have one quick question, just kind of a personal thing. So as a guy who calls himself a radical, a man who stands on stage and has no problem taking the slings and arrows, how have you developed the thick skin to deal with criticism? Can you there's a lot of people out there that they don't want to stand up. They're afraid of what their friends are going to say. They're afraid of what their family is going to say. They don't want to stand outside the crowd. Walter Williams clearly has no problem being outside the crowd. So how did you learn this ability to not let criticism eat you up?
Well, it doesn't bother me. Matter of fact, a lot of criticism I find very helpful. Because criticism is the way to learn. Criticism is a way to learn, maybe to explain your message in another way. And then on top of it, I have a rich physical endowment. I'm 6'5", so people have to think twice before, that makes you less subject to intimidation. And then it's no longer applicable today. But when I was in the Army, I had a lot of problems in the Army. I was stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia, and one time an officer told me, Williams, with all these things you're doing, you're going to get in trouble. And so I said, what kind of trouble can you possibly get me in? Are you going to paint me black and send me to Georgia? I'm already in trouble.
Hey, you say 6'5", but I noticed somewhere that you recently found out in the last bunch of years that your second cousin was Dr. J. So he had a few more inches on you, huh? Oh,
yes, he did. Yeah. Yes, he did. Yes.
Hey, Dr. Williams, where is the best place that the audience can go to find out more information about you?
Well, they can go to my website. It's walterewilliams.com. walterewilliams.com. And then also, what I will send to you, if you don't let me forget, there's the Free to Choose people. These are the people who made the Milton Friedman's series, Free to Choose. They've made a documentary on my life. They'll be coming out in the fall. And so what I'll do is I'll try to. And as a matter of fact, the title of the documentary is called "Suffer No Fools." Mm. And what I'll try to do is to send you a preview of it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The Free to Choose has sent out, I think, is like a 6-minute preview.
That'd be great. Maybe we can circle back on a follow-up conversation when it comes out, perhaps. But
yeah, right. And then it has also has a place where you can be notified when when it's going to be aired and other particulars.
It's tough to hang up with you. I got to go, but I tell you, because I can't keep you all day. But I could sit here for hours and pick your brain. I'm sure your students feel the same way sometimes. But hey, listen, I appreciate you giving my audience all your great insights. And hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Salem and Walter give some fantastic insights, don't they? Right? You could listen to both of those men all of the time. Now on to my final guest for this mega episode, Emmanuel German.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Michael?
I'm not too bad. Hey, I'm not sure if he's an acquaintance of yours or not, but a professor at Columbia was on my show recently, Alex Gracerman.
I've never met him. I know who he is.
Okay. It's a small world and a big world all at the same time, right?
Yeah. He teaches we have two sort of math finance, financial engineering programs. I think he teaches in the other one. I've often heard students who mention him, but I don't think I've ever met him.
Well, listen, we can cover a lot of topics today, and I'll try and throw a lot of different things at you. And you have a lot of different views and opinions on things that are fun and interesting. And when I reached out to you, and I guess we can start with this, I reached out to you, and you were asked by a publication to give a comment on this book, Capital in the 21st Century, I believe it's called. And you didn't really offer a view on it. You took it as an opportunity to offer some feedback on economists. And I want to give a quick quote just to give a flavor of your view that was published, and I'm sure you're going to expand on it. But you talked about that the public arguments of economists often have an incestuous yet masturbatory quality that's exhausting to follow. The only field more self-confidently but just as regularly wrong as economics is nutrition. Boy, that's just laying down the gauntlet, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Although I've actually once wrote something not quite as inflammatory, but in a blog when I used to blog on wilmot.com years ago. But I think it's true. I mean, I was careful thinking about masturbatory and incestuous, but I think it's right. It's incestuous because they're actually all very closely related to each other and yet having a passionate relationship with each other, which is sort of a characteristic of incest. And it's masturbatory in that it never gets resolved. It's sort of fruitless. You read Paul Krugman or you read John Cochrane. They're always battling. They write the same things over and over again and never convince each other.
Before we even get into the subject of the book, which I know you stated in the article that you had not read, your point really was you didn't even want to get into the debate because you felt like the people that are the debaters, the people that are pushing forth the argument and their research, their homework behind it is not even worth the time because it's so wildly different across so many different views.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true of Piketty. I mean, I know Piketty. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. People say Piketty. I haven't read his book. I've read reviews of it. I said I don't really want to spend 600. So the trouble with a lot of books is you can condense them in one line in a way. Mm-hmm. I don't want to read it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if inequality has increased. I don't really have anything against his book. I've just got a bad feeling. I mean, economics dominates the daily newspapers and the talk shows and the op-eds so violently that I've heard other people say too, I just don't feel like reading another book. I don't think Piketty himself irritates me. It's just the class of endless argument. And it's like nutrition in the sense that they're very scathing about each other. I know I'm simplifying. They're very scathing about each other, but they're never able to convince each other.
I saw you make a comment in an interview. You said something to the effect of engineering, chemistry can be value free. It is what it is. Economics, I saw you define as, we might as well be calling it a moral science. Why don't you explain your thought process there?
Yeah, I like that. I think, economics, I've never studied economics in my life. I'm a novice. I went to school in South Africa, which is like a British system where you major in whatever you're going to major right away, undergraduate. So I did sciences from the age of 16 and a half. I learned finance on the job. When I came to Goldman Sachs in 1985, somebody gave me the Black-Scholes, actually the Cox-Ross-Rubenstein and Black-Scholes model to read, and then threw me in feet first. So I come late to economics. But in my youth, people who studied economics, they did PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. And if you look at Black-Scholes, I think it's originally published in the Journal of Political Economy or something like that. And economics wasn't always so mathematical. It was. I don't have my Guardian article about Piketty in front of me, but I said something like, economics is about how to spend limited resources to achieve what people think is worthwhile achieving, and that's a kind of moral decision. It's not a mathematical decision. The mathematics is a technique, but it takes some bigger view of the world and some agreement to decide, or maybe disagreement in the end, about what's actually worth doing. Am I answering your question? I'm not sure.
Well, and I think what you're really getting at, too, is that economics is it's being positioned as something that it's not. There's always going to be a human or a moral element, as you say. It's not just a formula that you let run. If it was, there wouldn't be such a massive disagreement out there.
Right. I can't put it better than that. But that's sort of actually not from Piketty and not from Darren Asimoglu, whom I actually met. I gave a talk somewhere in Germany about a month ago, and he gave a talk on what makes nations fail. And that's sort of, as best as I could understand, in the more classical economic framework, although he told me that he actually started out as a very mathematical economist, and you sort of had to do that.
When you decided to give the opinion on the Piketty work, were you in the back of your mind also sharing or having a belief on his basic premise?
I don't question his basic premise, but just intuitively, I think it's probably likely. It's likely to be true. I was really, in some sense, I was just ranting against the state of economic discourse and using him as a crutch. I haven't read his book, as I said in that article, and I suspect what he says is right. But he became, I don't know, every few months or every few years, there's this craze about some book, and he was the current one. I think I tweeted one day, I can't remember what was before that. At one point, it was Michael Lewis's book, which I actually did read. Forget what it's called now. Do you know which one I mean? The last one.
Yeah, I get a kick how you think about this stuff. I sometimes feel the same way. Is that there's so much information, you take it in, and sometimes books, and I even look at some of my books like this. Sometimes it's really one great idea is all it is.
Yes. If you don't want to read, a lot of books can be summarized in a short space.
Let me take you back a few years. I think you have some opinions on this subject as well. And I still talk to people about it. It's still, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but it still bothers me to this day that all 4 of the U.S. investment banks were not allowed to go by the wayside.
Yeah, I'm horrified at what happened. I argue a lot with friends what happened in the bailout, in the sense that if capitalism is going to make sense for anybody, it's a brutal business, but the idea is you pay your money or you make your bets and you take the results. And that didn't happen. We bailed out. Who are you talking about specifically?
Well, I mean, we went down the line. Bayer disappeared, and Lehman Brothers disappeared, and then we got to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and they kind of said the line in the sand.
Yeah, they were about to disappear. I actually went to a sort of ex-Goldman People's Party shortly after that. And people were saying that they were really scared that weekend. They were planning, they were expecting the end, And I think it was the Fed or the Treasury went in and made them a bank holding company and literally saved their bacon. People say, and I think it's right, that they didn't own junk the way maybe Merrill or eventually Bank of America did. But still, even if you go down for systemic reasons, as opposed to your bad decisions, that's still one of the risks that you knew about and took. And I don't think you deserve to be saved, and not at public expense.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty straightforward opinion. I happen to share it. I think a lot of other wise people share it as well, too. Let me get you to go back in time, though. So ultimately, you get your PhD in theoretical physics. You had that before you started at Goldman?
Oh yeah, I have a roundabout route. I got a PhD in 1973, and actually, unlike a lot of the physicists on Wall Street, I actually worked for 7 years afterwards as a physicist doing research. So from 73 to 80, I was a postdoc in various places in University of Pennsylvania, and then in Oxford, and then at Rockefeller University in New York. And then I was an assistant professor. Am I getting too long-winded here?
No, not at all.
Okay, then I was assistant professor at University of Colorado at Boulder, which was a very nice place. But my wife was in academic life too, in biology, and we were always moving in different places. And we had a small kid already. My son was born in England. And I sort of threw the towel in. I got kind of tired of the whole thing. It was getting too hard to find a job where you wanted. And I was getting a bit disillusioned in general. So I went to work at Bell Labs, which was what Wall Street is now was for physicists. In 1980, Bell Labs, and actually the energy industry, Exxon labs were the places where technical people went when they couldn't get university jobs anymore. So I went there for 5 years. And then I came to Goldman in 1985.
So now you would have been at the front line of physicists being hired onto Wall Street. I mean, you were right there at the beginning stages of that.
Close to the beginning, but not absolutely. I interviewed in 83 when I was at Bell Labs. I came away at Goldman, and I didn't take a job. And then 2 years later, I kind of had enough, and I did. But there were people there already, I would say, from the very late 70s or early 80s in a small amount.
By the time, having been at Bell Labs and then going to Goldman, you were well aware of what Goldman was. You were not kind of just new to the idea of Wall Street and whatnot. You're like, okay, I know how my experience can benefit myself going to this investment bank. You knew as you were taking that position. It wasn't, I've talked to some folks that actually have gone in with your type of background and they really were like, well, just tell me that I didn't know anything.
I wasn't as knowledgeable as you say. I was at Bell Labs. I was for 5 years in what they called a business analysis system center or business systems analysis center. I can't quite remember. It was sort of it was a lot of ex-scientists already doing other stuff, mostly computerish. But I didn't know that much about Wall Street. I learned a little bit of finance. They sent me once to an MIT sort of exec ed course for 2 weeks, where I learned a little bit about the capital asset pricing model, but didn't really understand it. I went to Wall Street more because I'd had it with Bell Labs. And I was sitting there the whole time for several years thinking, should I try to go back to physics academic life, which was really hard because I wanted to stay in New York. And I wasn't even sure if I could get a job, and I would sort of had to go back a bunch of career steps, or jump all the way out of the ivory tower, which Bell Labs was partially, and go to Wall Street. And you were getting lots of calls from Wall Street headhunters in those days. They were fishing, dropping their bait in Bell Labs, and eventually I gave in. Not sure what I was in for, really.
Well, that's kind of where I was going to go. So you have an idea of what Goldman Sachs is and perhaps how your skills might be used, and then you get there. What were some of the feelings, experiences that you can talk about early on that perhaps were the real eye opener about what you were in the middle of?
Yeah, it was actually, I almost feel a little bad saying it, but it was actually quite wonderful because I felt like a real trader leaving physics in 1980 and leaving things that I liked. And Bell Labs, I was kind of unhappy for 5 years, almost from the moment I got there. Maybe I'd been unhappy anywhere I would have gone after being in physics, but Bell Labs was the place, and it was very bureaucratic. It was part of AT&T. They had 1 million people. There were literally a staff of 1 million people. There was an incredible bureaucracy in which, every 4 members of technical staff worked for a supervisor. Every 4 supervisors worked for a department head. Every 4 department heads worked for whatever it was. And everybody was asking permission all the time for everything. And coming from physics, I was used to sort of thinking, I'm going to live or die by my own skill, not be part of a big bureaucracy. And so when I came to Goldman, this is in 1985, there were maybe 5 or 6 or 7,000 people there. It was large already, but nothing like now. It was actually very entrepreneurial in a good way. I was doing research. I wasn't really a market person. I wasn't a trader. I wasn't a salesman. they had a very intellectual environment, at least for people like me. And in addition, unlike at Bell Labs, maybe this sounds counterintuitive, but at Bell Labs, I always had the feeling that everybody wanted to be a supervisor, and they were going to climb over your back to become one. And what people really respected, except for a few isolated counterexamples, what people respected was the ability to be a manager. And when I came to Goldman, if you're a geek, if you're a programmer, if you could solve differential equations, you might be sort of a little weird, but you got paid not badly, and people kind of respected you. So it was actually, I got very excited coming there. I got a real shot in the arm. I write in my book that I used to go up and down on the subway to work reading Cox and Rubenstein on options markets and feeling like I had something to learn and something to contribute.
Let's break apart, one of your great lines, My Life as a Quant, the title of your book too. Why don't you break apart model building and your model building at Goldman Sachs, the good and bad of it? Pick a way to kind of let the audience, look, some of my audience is inexperienced, some of them are very experienced, and perhaps your peers. But why don't you just describe the idea of model building and how you were indoctrinated to model building and the types of models that you were building?
That is a big question. I'm trying to think how to work my way into it. But I came there, and as I said, the first thing somebody did was throw Cox-Ross-Rubenstein model, binomial model at me, asked me to read it, and then start fixing a program that didn't work, that had some errors in it. Well, first of all, I'm trying to think. First of all, I worked very closely with traders. The research group I was in worked very closely with traders who actually used these models. So I liked it because it was a bit like being a theoretical physicist where you worked closely with experimentalists, which is what I had done in my previous life, the traders being the experimentalists.
You could apply it right there.
Yeah, it was very nice because God knows if it's ethically justifiable. I ran into people who cursed me at the time when I said I was working on Wall Street, but you actually worked on a model and it was iterative and there was lots of interaction. You started doing something, a trader would try it, they would give you some feedback. They knew what the actual financial problem was better than you did. So that part was very exciting. It was like a collaboration between people using it and people trying to understand how to make something that would work for them. They understood the markets, you understood the math better, and maybe the modeling. One of the things that became very clear to me at the time and was that user interface was very important. I had a background from Bell Labs in building user interfaces and building not just Fortran programs, but real Unix sort of trading systems. And one of the things that became very clear to me was that what mattered a lot for a model was not just the extra math or the extra finance or the extra computer science or statistics. It was an interdisciplinary mix of all of those, but that the ergonomics was very important. The first thing I did was replace a very old-fashioned model that didn't have a screen at all, and you had to enter all the data line by line in a question and answer way. This was a long time ago in 1985. And I built from scratch. I knew how to do it. There were no spreadsheets in those days. I built a screen that moved the cursor around and asked the user, enter the coupon, enter the maturity date, enter the option expiration, maturity date for the bond, and then saved all that information so that if he came back the next day, he could look at the same trade and try to analyze it again if they hadn't done it yet. And I suddenly realized how important the software environment is in addition to the model. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I just, sometimes it's just you just want to get inside folks' minds, have them relay some experiences. I think that's what the audience enjoys. The audience enjoys just hearing people, how they walked their path. So there's nothing you're going to say that's going to be boring. You've had an interesting career. You know that.
Okay. I like the mix of theory and software. And I think it was very important. And actually, when I ran groups later, I didn't like to separate the so-called information technology part from the quantitative financial part. I liked one person who could do both of those. And that's the way I grew up, doing my own dirty work. That's the way I sort of lived for most of the time I was on Wall Street. And these things go in phases, actually. Then somewhere around the late 90s, that changed, and the IT people and the quant people became separate, the thinkers and the developers. But I think it's gone the other way again now with algorithmic trading and trading systems. There's been a unification of those skills in one person again. And I think that's good. It makes for a much more interesting life as well.
I start this conversation off letting you compare economics to perhaps other sciences. One of the things that you've also done, though, too, is compare finance models to physics models. And look, I can think of people in my world, having written some books about the style of trading called trend following, and many of these traders today, and I understand why they do it, and it makes perfect sense to me, are coming at in their public and private announcements from a scientific method standpoint. They're describing their methods in science terms. I can think of two traders, one running about a $25 billion fund and one running about a $5 billion fund. Combined, they got pretty good money. They're unrelated, but the reason I bring it up is that Goldman Sachs owns 10% of each of them. And so I'm curious if you would break apart, because I've got some other points here, but why don't you break apart big picture wise the notion of the financial model and science and just the physics model and science?
I like to say that finance and physics have the same syntax, but not the same semantics. In that, if you look at a finance paper and a physics paper, the finance paper looks much more formal than most physics papers these days. Everybody in economics writes, I can talk about that later, writes in the strange mathematical axiomatic style. But the semantics is different. Even though they both use maths and you might naively confuse one for the other, it's very different. In physics, you actually have equations that accurately describe the world to a very high degree of accuracy and predict the future. And most financial models don't predict the future. That's not the way people in the trading world use them. They usually take a model and calibrate it to liquid current prices and then use it to estimate in the present the value of less liquid things. People really predict the future. They rather try to figure out what illiquid things are worth given the price of liquid things. That's what Black-Scholes really does for you. It tells you if you know the price of a short-term bond interest rates, in other words, and if you know the price of a stock, it'll tell you roughly what the price of an option should be. So it's always going from the present to the present, not from the present to the future. So that's one big semantic difference. Secondly, it just doesn't work as well. A lot of finance is really glorified interpolation. That's not an insult. It's just a fact. In the way that I described, you're trying to go from liquid known fungible prices to illiquid values and estimate them. That doesn't work badly as long as the world stays in the same sort of state as you're in when you calibrated the model. But when trouble comes, all bets are off. Your models don't really work. I kind of like to say that all financial models, at least of the kind that I worked on, are really short volatility in the sense that when volatility increases, they're going to do badly.
Well, that's an interesting point because I was thinking about, for example, Nassim Taleb and Mark Spitznagel, and thinking about the trend following world, my world, it's a lot of long volatility. When you think about models, though, is it your experience, the short volatility models is where you really have the issue? Or do you also look at the long volatility models and say, I've got some concerns there as well?
No, I was actually talking, I think both. I was just saying in a way that whether you build long vol models or Taleb, I'm stepping aside, Taleb and Spitznagel, I think are less building models than just saying, it'd be smart to be long volatility, not short volatility, because when trouble comes, you'll make money if you own out of the money options. I think they're not really building structural models in the sense that, say, Black-Scholes is or something like that. But what I was trying to say is if you're a long vol or if you're a trend follower, that's good as long as the world stays fairly calm. But hidden inside there in the market, there's something that's making you short vol because if you get a big increase in volatility, your model is probably going to be wrong. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no. I was thinking from a trend following perspective, changes in volatility. Look, nobody can predict the future. And I think it's how I'm very interested in your view of finance models compared to physics models. And I guess I was just curious the types of models that you were specifically thinking of when you started to go down this comparison between the two.
I was thinking of CAPM, efficient markets, Black-Scholes, almost any of the models that I face every day, although I mostly come from a derivatives world, not from at least when I worked on Wall Street, not from an asset management world.
But the big issue for you ultimately, and if we just break this down to simple terms, how does one estimate risk?
Yeah, I think I'm trying. Let me go back to what I was saying before,
Sure.
And then I'll come back to that. But in physics, for some wonderful reason, okay, in this book I wrote called Models Behaving Badly, I tried hard to distinguish epistemologically somehow between the idea of a theory and a model. And I said theories are things that really try to describe the world the way it is. So, for example, in Newton's laws, you say force equals mass times acceleration, and there's nothing relative about that. You say that's the way the world is. You may be right, you may be wrong, but that's what Newton says. And so physics has two classes of attempts to understand the natural world. One is theories, where they say something like force equals mass times acceleration, which is just a statement about the way somebody thinks the world works, and it actually does. And then the other one so that's an absolute model, an absolute statement, and I call that a theory. And a model is more of an analogy, where you say the nucleus is like a liquid drop of water. That's not an absolute statement, that's a relative statement. What you're saying is, for example, you can think of the nucleus of an atom as a vibrating, rotating drop of water. And somebody actually got the Nobel Prize for that model because it works pretty well. But everybody in physics understands that saying the nucleus, it's called the liquid drop model of the nucleus. Everybody in physics understands that that's a model, but that Newton's laws are a theory. And what makes it a model is that it's making a comparison between something you understand and something you don't. I don't think finance has any theories. If you look at efficient market models or Black-Scholes, finance models are saying stock prices behave like smoke diffusing, or like Brownian motion, like dust particles bumping around, being bumped by atoms in a room. And those are analogies, and they're insightful, but they're not true. They're not true in the way that Newton's laws are true. So they break down at some point. And I don't think finance has any real absolute theories that are correct. So, for example, coming back to what you said about risk, at least the traditional sort of modern portfolio theory measures risk as the standard deviation of returns. And that would be the real risk if stocks really did behave like particles of dust being bumped around under Brownian motion, but they don't. It's not a bad model. It's not a bad analogy to give you a feel for what things are like, but it's actually not true. No, I think that's the big difference between physics and finance, is that physics somehow has this ability, because it's dealing with inanimate objects, to write down something that works pretty well, and finance can really only make analogies that ultimately fail.
You know, right now, at this point of your career, you're in the academic community again. So, those are pretty strong statements. Do you find a significant amount of pushback from others in the academic community when you say things so bluntly as you just did? Or do they kind of go, "Oh shit, don't say that," because we know it's true, but
that's an interesting question. I mean, I think people who work on Wall Street on trading desks agree with what I'm saying, and I've heard people say similar stuff. I worked for Bob Litzenberger at one point, and he certainly felt similarly. I think everybody understands that on Wall Street, and good traders understand that. And I think people at Goldman understand that, which is why they didn't lose a lot of money. They maybe should have gone down because the whole system was going to go down, but they didn't go down out of buying bad securities. But academics most of the academics I've met have a very bad mental model of the way people use models. And I think they don't understand what I was saying. They tend to teach economics and finance in a very mathematical way with axioms and theorems and lemmas, and don't really worry about whether that's true or not. They don't understand how sloppily but intelligently people use models in a trading environment.
it struck me, not having your background, but looking at a lot of different white papers, and sometimes some of them I just kind of glaze over. But you've made the comment, the idea that, finance papers often these days clearly look like science papers. And I saw you make the comment that it's almost a perversion of common sense. That's, the idea of human behavior being put into these formulas that resemble physics formulas is kind of maybe fooling ourselves, isn't it?
I think you have to I think if you want to work in this field intelligently, you have to be a little bit schizophrenic. You sort of have to, you can't avoid using mathematics, but you have to keep looking over your shoulder all the time and saying, I know this isn't really right. And I know it's going to break down because I'm describing people and markets which are driven by people, and they don't really work this way except for a small period of time or in a small range of environments which may change at any instant. So I think you have to sort of keep being suspicious about everything you do, which I think academics don't do. They have this, I'm talking blanket terms, but they have this idea that you can write down something and just keep going, and that the world actually works that way. And if your model doesn't work, they somehow think somewhere out there is a holy grail model and we're getting closer and closer to it. But I don't think that's the case at all, because the environment in which you use the models keeps changing, and even using a new model changes the environment, and you don't really get closer and closer to this. In physics, maybe you get closer and closer to the grand theory of everything. Maybe you don't, but at least you could plausibly argue that you do. But I think it's a mistake to think that way in finance.
When you talk to your students and you're talking about quantitative models, you want them to be able to explain them qualitatively as well, too, huh?
Yes, I do. I think and I think that's something, well, I learned that in physics, but I learned it at Goldman too, that if you want to communicate with people who use these models but aren't as numerate as you are, it's very important to understand the model from an intuitive point of view, or from a visceral point of view. You don't just want to do a calculation and say this is the answer. You want to understand, preferably in advance, what the answer might look like and what are the important parts that enter. And that's when you really learn a lot. And I think that's, to some extent, the benefit of getting a PhD, which in itself doesn't mean that much. But I think, at least in physics, when you get a PhD, you have to go through a lot of hard struggle to not just derive equations, but understand what they mean in a qualitative way. And anyway, I try to impress that on the students, and they do it, but it's a hard job.
I was going to say, for some very bright teenage students, very bright math aptitudes, trying to explain to them why they need to spend their time also proving this qualitatively is probably sometimes they might look at you and go, why?
There are, finance, you can be a math genius at age 18, or you can be a chess genius at age 16 or 17 or 18. I think you can't be a physics genius that early, and you can't be a finance genius that early. It takes a lot more understanding of the world than just playing chess.
Yeah, fair point. Listen, Emmanuel, I appreciate you coming on today. I just want to have a quick chat. I know you had some interesting perspectives. I'm up to close to 300 podcast episodes, and like I said, I'm sure many of the folks I've had on have been your peers. But I thought you had some really very strong, clear views about economics, finance, and a science such as physics, and kind of comparing and contrasting all three. And I think it's good food for thought for people just to stay grounded and keep their eyes wide open. As you say, keep looking behind you as well, too, and keep worrying and being a little skeptical that there could be a breakdown. Things might not go the way you expect, might not go the way that the formula dictates.
I think physics and finance are very different. I said before, they use the same language and they use some of the same skills, but the meaning of what they do is very different.
Yeah.
But I'm a bit sad about the way economics has gotten so mathematical, and even finance. It's gotten much more mathematical than physics in a way. People in physics, I said this in my book, but you write down equations and sometimes they're tremendously efficacious, even if you're not very formal, in the sense they really do explain things. And in finance, you can't get published these days unless you write very mathematical papers, and often they have no efficacy at all.
I mean, that's got to be shocking for quite a few people to hear. I mean, you've got, it's not like you're a new guy on the block and you're just basically saying that if I get back to your original descriptor that I pulled from that article, you basically just described a good portion of the field that are writing these finance papers as publishing mental masturbation. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like what you're saying.
It's all exaggerated a little bit. It doesn't apply, but I think it's true. And then the counterexample to that is behavioral economics. And I once wrote a column for a German newspaper. I'm kind of disappointed in behavioral economics too. I got very excited when I first started to learn about it because it seemed like what Kahneman and Tversky were going to do and what did set out to do, although I learned it much later, was to explain people's anomalous, mistaken intuitions about risk in a mathematical way. So they don't like losses. They're willing to do anything to cover their losses, even irrationally. And they try to describe all this in prospect theory. And it looked really the right way to go, to try to sort of build the mathematics of the way people actually behave rather than the way efficient markets assume. But I think it's gotten kind of perverted. When I look at behavioral finance now too, a lot of the articles are about gender issues in CEOs. If I Googled for a minute, I would find my article that I wrote. But they just, if you look at the SSRN newsletter of behavioral economics, so many of the articles are about, whether stock markets do worse the day after they lose a game in the World Cup.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I'm not making these things up. Or CEOs' gender studies, or small market anomalies. They're sort of mildly interesting, but you get the feeling that they don't amount to a whole discipline in the way that classical economics did, or even efficient markets. And that people are sort of just digging around for things to publish. Doing something similar to what somebody else did before in a slightly different case so they can have an article.
It's a great point. I sometimes look at behavioral economics and finance and I say, well, gosh, it's like grasping for straws to come up with an example for this particular week, month, or year. Whereas maybe the original guys, as you mentioned, had some innovative and novel thought. But today it does seem like people are reaching.
Yeah. I mean, classical, or whatever you call it, classical portfolio theory or efficient market, it's not strictly correct, but there's something comprehensive and attractive about it. And behavioral economics started out that way too, but I think it's gone astray. And it's gone astray in another way too, in that it's become a political tool, in the sense that the people who are using so-called behavioral economics a lot are really politicians. Yeah, Richard Thaler, I believe, was head of behavioral economists for Obama. They're trying to, so the people who are using it are advertisers and politicians or political manipulators, both in the business of manipulation, trying to portray politicians to you depending on what you clicked on last, trying to show you that part of the politician that would appeal to you if you're that kind of person. Am I making sense? So they look at your profile on the web, and if you're one kind of person, they'll show you one side of the political person they want you to vote for candidate. If you're on another, if you've clicked on other things, they'll show you something different. And I don't think that's a great way to run a democracy. I was sort of used to growing up in South Africa where there were big issues, and you look to politicians to lead you rather than to follow. Now they seem to want to figure out what is it you want, and then I'll pretend to be that, as opposed to people like Obama or actually Gorbachev or de Klerk who got one step ahead of history by trying to figure out how to get to a non-violent solution rather than trying to figure out what people want and say, I'll give it to you, I'll pretend to give it to you.
Yeah, but I think you probably, if we really were to get scientific about politicians, we could probably all argue, regardless of political stripe, left, right, center, they all kind of work from the same playbook.
Yeah. I wasn't criticizing one particular, just what you said. I wasn't criticizing one particular one. I was sort of more saying there's a style of politics now which is to sort of lead from behind rather than from in front.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's all about polling and what is your particular view, as you mentioned, and just trying to deliver the flavor of the week and make somebody happy for that moment in time. But there's very little of that stand up, this is the right direction, this is the way we need to go. Look, a great example, I know you're probably up in the New York area. I mean, would we ever build the Brooklyn Bridge today? Of course not.
Oh my God, that's so depressing. I live in Manhattan, and I remember when the West Side Highway fell down when I still worked at Bell Labs, and I had to drive that way every day in the 80s. And nobody's ever rebuilt it, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. There's getting things done has become so protracted, and that's a whole different subject. We could go on there, but listen, I appreciate you coming on because you've got a really wide perspective, and I think it's fun to kind of take these different disciplines, connect them together, contrast them, kind of pull them apart, and you've seen it and lived it. So I appreciate you coming on today. Hey, where's the best place people can check out your books on Amazon, but your best website to send people to? Where should we send them to?
I have a website called www.emmanueldurman.com, which has a lot of the stuff, not easily accessible, but it's all there. I want to clean it up. I have these two books, Models Behaving Badly, which is the later one, and My Life as a Quant, which are both available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble as ebooks or as hardcover. And I actually wrote a lot of, if somebody's interested, I wrote a lot of columns for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung at one point for about a year and a half related to some of these things. And I've got them all in an ebook together with some short stories called Bad Behavior on Amazon. And it's got a lot of general sort of short articles about this kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, absolutely. People can go grab your books and dig a little bit deeper on some of your life experiences. We can only touch on so much in 45 minutes. And it's our first time talking. So sometimes if you get some slightly crazy guy calling you from Asia, peppering you with questions, you got to kind of stop and pause for a second and say, where do I want to take this? Yeah, I understand the feeling.
No, I enjoyed this. I didn't know much about it before, but it was very interesting.
Hey, Emmanuel, thanks again. And hopefully maybe we can catch up again in the near future.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.